Firstly, the GIMMS team is delighted once again to extend a very warm welcome to our global online audience for this first event of 2021. In normal times, we would be looking forward to a new year full of resolutions and hope for better days to come. Whilst that might seem a little premature, given the increasingly uncertain times we are living in, both politically and economically, and also in respect to the ongoing COVID-19 emergency, this is a moment to take courage and reinforce our determination to continue our campaign to bring modern monetary reality to the already growing audience and challenge the economic orthodoxy which has done so much damage in recent decades. The task ahead remains a daunting one, not least in terms of addressing climate change, but also tackling the vast wealth and other inequalities that exist in both rich and poor countries across the planet, which have exacerbated the crisis and hampered a more targeted global and national response to the challenges that we face. Public and social infrastructure is in a state of decay, and the cracks revealed by COVID-19 are widening and deepening, leading to disillusionment with political parties of either stripe or growing social unrest. The economic ideology which has influenced public policy globally for more than half a century and promised trickle down of wealth has proved no more than an illusion and has left vast swathes of people in poverty, increased economic instability across the planet, and created huge divides in access to real resources. Let us not underestimate the challenge before us. It is a stark one. However, the light at the end of the tunnel is getting brighter. As knowledge about how governments really spend becomes more widespread, and as many governments across the world switched on the hitherto elusive monetary pumps, people have begun to grasp that it is political choice and agendas which determine how monetary and real resources are shared. There is a growing recognition that the deceitful image of money scarcity has no place in our global society. Much has already changed, even in an environment where the usual debt doomsters are still attempting to carry on with their paltry narratives about rising debt, the need to cut public services or cap public sector wages to get the public accounts back in order at some yet to be announced date, and scaring the pants off people about the prospect of higher taxes and burdens on future generations. But we should not be without hope that we can make a difference, even when we feel despondent at the speed of change, which often seems far too slow given the challenges we face. MMT is gaining ground as the UK-based Gower Initiative and the MMT podcast, along with other global movements, continue with their efforts to provide an educational platform to challenge the economic orthodoxy that has defined our age. The world has certainly changed irrevocably and in the most distressing way. But in doing so, it has revealed a broken economic system and thus provided an opportunity for those movements to gain ground. Now, we are delighted today to welcome our good friend and advisory board member, Fadhel Kaboub, who we had the privilege of meeting at a seminar event in London in 2018, at which he explained the case for a job guarantee. Certainly a subject we will be hearing more and more of in the days to come as we grapple with the economic fallout from COVID-19 and the coming climate change challenges. His enthusiasm was an inspiration and provided much needed encouragement as we worked on setting up GIMMS for the launch later in the same year. Fadhel is an associate professor of economics at Denison University and the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. His work focuses on public policies to enhance monetary and economic sovereignty in the global south, build resilience, and promote equitable and sustainable prosperity. So just before I hand you over to Phil and Fadhel, don't forget, we have a website full of useful resources where you can also sign up for our newsletter for updates. And actually, just to let you know, our most recent can be found on our website now. And also, importantly, to make donations. We are a voluntary organisation that depends on your contributions and generosity to continue our work. So without further ado, over to you, Phil and Fadhel. Thank you.
Thank you, Prue. I'm waiting for Fadhel to appear. I'm hoping on the screen. Hey, good. You make me nervous a little bit there, Fadhel, for a moment, but delighted to see you. Yeah, great privilege for me to interview Fadhel today. I followed his work quite closely. Very much someone who we think of as understanding MMT's wider applicability across the world, particularly in the global south. Obviously, he's a core MMT thinker, very important member of the academic MMT community, but offers things that I would argue other members of the major MMT community don't do. So we're all fascinated to hear Fadhel's opinions on various issues. We'll take some questions at the end, but I've got a few just to warm Fadhel up. And the first one really is what I often say in these is really what for you, Fadhel, are the key aspects of MMT that motivate you, that drive you, and how did you get into it? What's your sort of MMT story, if you like?
Well, thank you, Phil, for hosting this event, and thank you, everybody from GIMMS for all the good work that you're doing in the UK and beyond to bring the MMT ideas to the general public. So my MMT story is pretty straightforward. I went to grad school in Kansas City at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. I grew up in the Middle East. I grew up in Tunisia, did my undergraduate degree there, which was not a typical mainstream economics program. There were a handful of French regulation school, post-Keynesians, institutionalists, people who were really interested in the history of economic thought and political economy in general. But it was, a standard economics program. We had Krugman textbooks and things like that. So I was already aware that there were some alternatives to the mainstream. So that drew me to UMKC because I knew that there was something institutionalist, Keynesian type there happening, but I wasn't fully aware of what was about to unfold because I arrived there in January 2000. And that was 6 months after the Center for Full Employment and Price Stability had been inaugurated at UMKC with the arrival of Randy Ray, Matt Forstater, and Stephanie Kelton as the core faculty members who were about to launch what would become the MMT post-Keynesian Kansas City program. And a few months after that, Fred Lee joined the team. And the rest is history, as they say. So my idea was, well, I'm going to go to this program, do a master's degree, see how I like it. But then as soon as I got there, I knew that this is a very special place. And I ended up obviously finishing my PhD there. So that's kind of in brief my MMT story. I discovered it in the classroom. It turned my world upside down, as it should, in a good way. Yeah. But it also left me wondering. I remember Ed Nell came and gave a talk about the job guarantee early in my days at UMKC, even before taking, I think, Randy's class. So I didn't really know about the job guarantee yet. It was kind of mid-semester, a guest speaker. And he blew me away And I was like, wait a minute, what you're saying can be massive for a developing country like Tunisia, because I was always thinking about how do all these ideas apply in the global South? And I quickly discovered there wasn't much work in the post-Keynesian literature on how those ideas would apply in the global South with all the different constraints and structural issues. And that kind of motivated my work to do my dissertation on Tunisia, on the job guarantee, and to constantly think about how does this modern money framework apply in the developing world. And at the time, there was really very few people even discussing this. I was also fortunate to engage with our friend Daniel Koster from Argentina, who was at the time leading the effort to introduce the JEFES program in Argentina. He was at the Ministry of Labor in Argentina during the Great Depression, the crisis. And he visited at UMKC, and we've been friends and colleagues since then. So to the extent that there were discussions about MMT ideas in the global South or outside the US, that was it, a handful of people. But there were a lot of graduate students who were very interested in these ideas. But we're, as I always say, we're understaffed and outnumbered, because this is a massive transformation, paradigm shift in the economics discipline that requires, dozens of dissertations and research teams to really put together all the building blocks of a full, comprehensive, MMT-informed economic policy program for developing countries. But we've definitely sketched, the main parameters, and these are not things that you can, include in a Twitter thread in a comprehensive way and do justice to these things. But we're working on it, bit by bit, piece by piece.
Yeah, thanks, Fadhel. That's brilliant to hear that introduction. Now, in a way, the interview will probably have a thread running through it, in a sense. And so, I mean, obviously, you can see the questions, and you can kind of decide which parts you want, how you want to answer each one. Sure. With the reflection, what's to come. That's entirely up to you. But I think what interests me about your work, what makes it stands out, is very much this idea that of applying and taking into account the global South, these sorts of things. And I'm sure that you'll be well aware as anyone in the world, perhaps, of this criticism of MMT. It only applies in the US, the exorbitant privilege. It might have a little bit of application in countries like, Japan and the UK, but really, it doesn't apply to the global South, and forget it. So you'll have heard that many times, or variants on that theme. Yeah. What would be, in essence, your reply to that type of criticism?
Very good question. So this will allow me also to go back to your first question about what is MMT. The way I like to explain it these days is the following. So we always talk about the spectrum of monetary sovereignty. Different countries have different degrees of monetary sovereignty, different degrees of fiscal policy space, let's say. And what the mainstream economics profession tells us is that national governments have a very limited fiscal policy space, and it's constrained, just like a household, just like a private business, just like your local municipality and your local state. They say the national government is constrained by the amount of tax revenues it can raise, and by its borrowing capacity, whatever financial markets will let your government borrow, up to a certain limit. So the constraint is there. You can't have unlimited government spending or larger government spending. And MMT essentially says, well, wait a minute, the fiscal policy space, the spending capacity of the national government is typically much larger than that. And I always follow by saying it's not unlimited. And I usually say it twice. It's not unlimited, because we see the critics always saying, MMT says government spending is unlimited. It's not unlimited. It is constrained, not by tax revenues and borrowing capacity, but it's constrained by the risk of inflation, which is determined by the degree of availability of real resources, physical equipment, technology, know-how, skills in the labor market, and so on. And the good news about that limit is that those resources are producible. We can train more doctors, we can train more engineers, we can build more machines, and so on. So with the proper strategic industrial planning, we can always expand that space by building strategically resources in the areas needed. The second risk that actually puts pressure on the inflation front is what I call abusive price setting behavior. And this is where you have, multinational corporations, the top 1%, the oligarchy applying their political influence, their economic influence to raise prices simply because they can. So here we're thinking of big pharma, we're thinking about the oil and gas industry, we're thinking about, health insurance companies in the US who charge what the draft. So this is where Fred Lee's work and the administered price, post-Keynesian approach comes into the MMT space. So to me, that's the real constraint, which gets into the political economy space, because it requires, in order to kind of tame that risk of inflation, it's not, austerity will not do it. So spending less will not eliminate the market power of those corporations. But how you do it? You do it by taxing and regulating their market power out of existence. So this is where the MMT approach to taxation becomes important. We don't need their money or their permission to fund a green jobs program or to fund education or healthcare. So that's kind of the general MMT framework. How does this apply in the global South? Well, you start with the same analytical lens, and then you realize very quickly that the constraints are obviously much more severe in the global South, that the fiscal policy space is much more limited, partly because of the limited availability of resources, real resources, in the sense that for strategic areas such as food, such as energy, which you can't run an economy without food and energy as basics. All of those tend to be, or the majority of those tend to be imported. So for developing countries, this is the area where you have a shortage of these critical resources that produces a trade deficit, which puts pressure on the exchange rate, downward pressure on the exchange rate. And now you're facing a choice as a developing country. If you do nothing about it, the exchange rate falls, and the next morning you're going to have food riots because everything you import is going to be, you're importing inflation, right? And we've seen that all over the place. So in order to prevent that social instability, those food riots and energy riots and so on, what does the government do? What does the central bank do? It goes into debt. It starts borrowing in foreign currencies and accumulating external debt denominated in dollars or euros or pounds or Japanese yen. And that's a structural issue. So the next morning, you're also importing fuel and you're importing food, and the next year and so on. So you constantly have this downward pressure on the exchange rate, which you can only relieve by borrowing externally. And that debt becomes unsustainable because there's no way you can pay it off. So that's kind of the description of it. And then you have this debate about, well, if there is there anything that those countries can do? Well, the answer is, making your exchange rate flexible or fixed, adding capital controls or not adding capital controls, all of those things are kind of superficial at the end of the day. What matters in the long term is, are you able to reclaim your economic sovereignty by producing more of your critical goods domestically? That is food, that is energy, that is high value added content, imports, and so on. And that's the long-term kind of big push in terms of economic development, that we're not going to end this vicious cycle unless we shift the paradigm of economic development towards those areas. But the mainstream approach to dealing with those currency crises in developing countries, it's the standard package, from the IMF and the World Bank and the mainstream of the profession, which says, try to accelerate your exports, right, to deal with the current account deficit. Try to encourage foreign direct investment. Try to encourage tourism, right? Bring more tourists, they bring dollars, they bring euros to help you with all of you, or open up your financial markets to foreign investors, things like that. Encourage more remittances from your workers, right? Immigrants working in Europe and the rest of the world. All of those things are temporary band-aids that actually make the problem worse in the long run. I'll just mention tourism as an example, or maybe FDI as an example. Tourism, the more people you bring and host in your country, the more food you have to import, the more energy you have to import to transport them and heat and cool the hotels for them. So that's a trap. You know, yes, you bring tourism, they bring euros, but you end up subsidizing the hotels, you end up importing more food and energy, which is the key trap that I talked about. In terms of encouraging exports or encouraging FDI, if your industrial infrastructure is not developed enough, mature enough, then you end up specializing in low value added content manufacturing, which means you import all the high value added content components of the electronics or whatever you're producing, and then you use subsidized cheap labor, race to the bottom in terms of environmental and labor standards in order to assemble those components and then for re-export. So what you've exported is the low value added content, and that's a trap. Yes, absolutely. When you set up a factory for assembly line type of work, you've supported 500 families, right, with income, which is important. But in the long term, you've just dug yourself deeper into that trap of low value added content specialization. So the structural solution in the long term, from an MMT perspective, from a post-Keynesian perspective, is to first invest in domestic energy production, and in this day and age, obviously, it has to be renewable energy production. Number two, invest in sustainable agricultural policies that will allow you actually to produce your key commodities domestically as much as possible using traditional techniques and the most sophisticated modern techniques and so on. And then the long term, investing in having a strategic industrial policy that allows you to climb up the ladder, so to speak, from low value added content manufacturing, become more selective in what kind of FDI you bring in and what kind of exports you subsidize in the first place. So those are kind of the policy shifts that you can't avoid if you understand the MMT framework. And then finally, I'll say one more thing that brings additional nuance to this, because I think a lot of people ask about capital controls and so on. Yes, it's one of the pieces in your toolbox, but in and of itself, it will not end this vicious cycle. The last thing I'll say is that the risk of inflation that I talked about earlier, that's determined by the lack of shortage of productive capacity and then abusive market power, in the context of developing countries, it becomes even more amplified. And of course, if you add corruption to it, if you add cross-border trafficking to it, which also overlaps with corruption and power and abuse, then you get into vicious cycles of inflation and structural problems that become very difficult to undo. I'll give you maybe an example. So as I said, I grew up in Tunisia. I'm originally from Tunisia, so I'm very familiar with the economy, with the underground, commodities trade between the Tunisian and the Libyan border, the Tunisian and Algerian border, and this became even more prominent in the last 10 years after the Tunisian uprisings, the Arab Spring, and so on. So you have the Tunisian central bank relies heavily on revenues from tourism, right? And after the events of 9/11, after the Arab Spring and all that, all the European tourists essentially stopped coming to Tunisia. We're talking about literally almost shifting to zero. So you have this massive hotel and tourism infrastructure that's gone, from 100% capacity almost in the summer to almost zero. And that opened up the opportunity for Algerian tourists, upper middle class Algerian tourists, to enter the Tunisian market. The problem is Algerians and the Central Bank of Algeria has a regulation that only gives a tourism allocation of 150 euros per person per year. Where can you go with 150 euros? You can't make it to the border with 150, essentially, which is essentially why it's designed. So in order for millions of tourists from Algeria to enter Tunisia, they have to get a hold of Tunisian currency or some other currency somehow, which happens to be the place where underground, commodity trafficking happens. So Tunisians cross the border and import a lot of made in China imports, satellite dishes, jeans and clothing and perfumes or whatever that are brought into Algeria via other countries. So they go in with Tunisian dinars, into Algeria to buy all of those goods, cross the border and sell them as, street vendors or shops or whatever. So now Algerian traders have Tunisian dinars, which they sell to Algerian tourists to enter Tunisia. So you have millions of Algerians coming to the country as tourists, but the central bank doesn't see a single euro. So, well, it used to be the case a decade ago that tourism brought foreign currency reserves. Now you can operate almost at full capacity with virtually no foreign currency reserves coming in. So these layers of complexity make the traditional model of economic development and of course, the tourism industry is subsidized in terms of food, in terms of energy, in terms of wages for workers, and so on. So we have to completely rethink. I'm not saying that Algerians coming to Tunisia is a bad thing. Obviously, the restaurant industry is thriving, the hotels are working, and so on. But from an economic policy standpoint, you can't rely on those mechanisms to do that. In terms of inflation and hyperinflation that is related to cross-border trafficking, and we've seen this in particular in countries like Zimbabwe, but it's really across most of the developing world. So when you have shortages of food, for example, or shortages of fuel, cross-border traffickers would go into the neighboring country, bring gasoline, bring milk, bring eggs, bring whatever they can bring across the border, and sell it at a higher price if there is a shortage. So now that cross-border activity that happens, if you add to it the fact that maybe the police is involved, maybe the military is involved, maybe the border control officers are involved. So now you have essentially armed guards who are controlling a market, right, via corruption, which means whatever you do to eliminate that market will be resisted in many cases by violence. So if you have networks of powerful people in government, in business, and military who are now, extracting value from that informal activity, they have no interest in encouraging domestic food production or domestic energy production because they literally would lose their market share. And that makes it extremely difficult to undo a vicious cycle of inflation and abuse and socioeconomic exclusion. So all of these nuances don't have any space in traditional economic policy, other than people talk about corruption vaguely, right? But it's the devil is in the detail. And what we're trying to do in the MMT analysis in the Global South is take into account all of these pressure points, which makes the analysis as multidimensional, as multifaceted as the real factors that actually determine the value of the currency, the exchange rate, and actually determine the real constraints that would prevent the government from introducing, say, a job guarantee or a more, aggressive fiscal policy program.
Well, Fadhel, thanks. Brilliant answer. The questions are flying at me like a snowstorm at the side here. That's a great answer, and so much nuance you bring into it. On a similar sort of thing, it's a bit of a family story. I'm an Armstrong, and I don't know if any of the listeners or you, they are known historically as border reivers. So not recently, I won't be arrested, I hope, but so many 100 years ago, let's put my thing back in. The Armstrong clan, as were, used to go into England from Scotland in the night, steal a load of horses or cattle, anything they could, kill a few people if they got in the way, and then a little bit later on in the morning, they go to another point in the border and sell all the cattle as stolen. The problem is, at the time, the Scottish chieftains were quite happy with that because they were making a lot of money out of it. So there was no really incentive to stop the Armstrongs doing that until they upset the King of Scotland. And that was the end of the Armstrongs' activity. And that's why Armstrongs are all over the world now. And one of them even went to the moon, I believe, allegedly. So there is no official clan leader. All right. I know it won't be me, that's for sure. But, these things have happened that you're talking about in our history, and I'm part of it.
But a lot of it is institutionalized today via government policy. So in the Global South in particular, if a country depends literally depends on food imports and fuel imports and medical equipment imports, then typically in most developing countries, the government would give an exclusive import license to either a government agency or private individuals, private corporations, to be the exclusive importer of wheat and corn and medicine and so on. So those individuals now have a massive market power and a vested interest in not seeing any domestic activity develop locally to displace their market power. So if I'm in that position, I'll do whatever I can to dismiss any academic research that says we need to build more economic sovereignty or food sovereignty, to use my power and influence in politics to make sure that those, alternative methods of production domestically don't get funded, don't get supported, don't get licensed by the government. And that's the nice way of doing it. And in some cases, it goes into actual abuse and violence against people who are trying to support these things. You would, fund the opposing political party in order not to develop a local agricultural policy and domestic renewable energy policy. So those things, those are the real obstacles. Those are the real constraints that suffocate the local economy. Whereas most mainstream economists and even our colleagues in the post-Keynesian literature, heterodox literature, focus exclusively on the exchange rate constraint, on capital controls. And those are important. But in the global South, those become sort of the justification for all the hidden nuances that we're talking about. And what I'm trying to argue is that, yes, those constraints are there, but it doesn't mean we should just give up and say, well, there's an external constraint, there's nothing we can do about it, so we should have a fixed exchange rate and capital control and surrender. And what I'm saying is that there are things we can do to, untangle those constraints. And those require long-term strategic intervention. And those interventions can't be purely economic. These are political by design, which means you need a social movement. You need political influence to undo the power and influence of the individuals and agencies. And those are domestic. I haven't talked about the external constraints yet, the geopolitical constraints. Those are real too. But it's not just because of imperialism and the power of the US dollar. Most of the influence is actually domestic. There's the external constraint, obviously. But we can develop strategies to undo those things.
Yeah, I mean, it's brilliant listening to you, Fadhel. I mean, fantastic. The thing is, we've had half an hour. I've only done 2 questions, so but fabulous answers. Now, here's the thing, Fadhel, and it sort of follows on. A lot of people are concerned about aid and thinking, like, in a way, talking about what you said about building food and energy sustainability as a long-term goal, if you like, in the global South, and not, as you said, I think we appreciate, I agree absolutely with this idea of the new position, the other financial things like capital control is very important, but deeper, nuance-wise, what you're saying. So against that backdrop, what would you say an understanding of MMT, if imagine the world understood MMT and their heart was in the right place to things in a way, how might, if you like, the richer countries of the world economically, what would be their role in providing aid? And you can define aid in any way you want, Fadhel.
Yeah, we have to redefine aid. That's where I was going to start.
I thought you might say something like that. Yeah.
So understanding MMT is necessary but not sufficient in addressing these global issues. So we're dealing about a global climate crisis, a global socioeconomic exclusion crisis, and so on. The COVID pandemic has obviously exposed a lot of these vulnerabilities. So if we start with the idea that there is a spectrum of monetary sovereignty, that different countries have different degrees of spending capacity, then we recognize immediately that the global South has very limited capacity to address those long-term structural issues. On top of that, the global North has a huge technological advantage that the global South doesn't have for addressing economic issues, for addressing climate change, and so on. So that adds another layer to the problem. The third layer to the problem is a deeper structural long-term issue that we can't ignore. which is the following. If we take the world and divide it into global south and global north, and then net out all the financial transactions, including exports and imports and interest payments and foreign direct investment and aid, right? Charity and remittances, workers and so on, you realize at the end of the day that the net amount is about $2 trillion moving from the global north, from the global south to the global north. So the flow is moving in the wrong direction. And this is annual, and this has been increasing for at least the last 2 decades. So in the early 2000s, this used to be $500 billion a year moving from the global south to the global north. This is the neo-colonial extraction of wealth from the global south. And it kept increasing. Today it's $2 trillion. If we have a discussion in 10 years, it'll be probably 5, 6, maybe $10 trillion. This is unsustainable financially, economically, politically, ethically, ecologically. This is a big deal. So in order for us to take the MMT lens and say, well, let's adjust things, we can't do that without reversing that flow. So the question becomes, how do you reverse that flow? UNCTAD actually has been, yelling and screaming about this for the last at least 2 decades, if not more. And in the last year, they've introduced their framework for a global Green New Deal, and they pointed specifically to this as an important component is to redo the global financial architecture, right? So they haven't talked about all the other components, but this is something to be highlighted in the UNCTAD proposal, and it's extremely important. So now, how do we undo the global financial structure and reverse that? My approach to this, and going back to your point about aid, is it's not right to call it aid. If you take into account the colonial history and the neo-colonial abuse that's been happening with the neoliberal mode of running the global financial system, it's not right to call it aid, especially in the context of climate crisis, because you can also look at the data historically and try to figure out who's actually the most responsible for CO2 emissions, for climate damage historically, from the Industrial Revolution to this day. And obviously it's the global north primarily, right? Even if you look at China and India today, because there's a lot of emissions from China and India in particular, the last 2 decades, you also realize that the carbon footprint of China and India is mostly for consumption in the global north. So we can clearly assign the responsibility for climate debt to the global north, right? So that's one legal, ethical, moral responsibility of transfer of resources, both financial resources and technological resources. So I'll talk about climate reparations. And if you think about repairing the damage, it does take some money, but it does take also in-kind contribution in terms of technology and repairing the damage, meaning repairing the broken structure that produces that flow of $2 trillion from global south to global north. So the question becomes, you have to make the economic, legal, moral, ethical argument for it. And now, how do you structure this in a systematic way? And that as soon as I started thinking about this, climate reparations and colonial reparations, which we can go into, you realize we're talking about trillions of dollars over the next several decades of transfer of resources, physical resources, technological resources, and financial resources to rebalance the global economic system, to rebalance the ecosystem also ecologically. And it just dawned on me that Keynes had a framework for us back in the day that wasn't concerned about colonialism, obviously. It wasn't concerned with the climate crisis, but it was a structural automatic stabilizer program to make sure that we don't have these structural imbalances between developed and developing countries. At the time, there were really no developing countries because they were colonies, but between countries that have trade surpluses and trade. So that was the Keynes plan, the Bancor plan from 1945, which was to automatically reallocate trade surpluses denominated in an international unit of account, right, that no single individual would use at the local supermarket. This is just an accounting, unit of account that central banks would keep track of. and automatically transfer resources to countries that need it the most. So you have those resources, you either spend it domestically to create domestic full employment, to address your local climate crisis, your local socioeconomic problems, including reparations to indigenous people and so on. But if you have the resources and you don't spend them domestically for whatever reason, you can spend them internationally. You can spend in some other country to help them create full employment or address their climate crisis. Or you can simply give up those resources to an international agency that would allocate those resources in the most needed areas of the world. So we can rapidly decarbonize the global economy, so we can rapidly undo the damage and rebalance the global economy. So that's kind of a sketch of a global Green New Deal framework that doesn't depend on aid and charity, but depends on recognizing that a damage has been done and continues to take place to this day, and that we're not going to save the planet. We're not going to address, all of these grievances by ignoring them or by turning them to charitable organizations.
So, I mean, if I'm thinking about, because I'm looking a little bit at how the questions in terms of the Green New Deal and the Bancor, how they kind of link up a little bit. So, when you talk about the Bancor system, this idea of the creditor adjusts, like Keynes is saying. So if a country had more of these Bancor units, whatever they were called, I think Paul Davidson has written about these types of systems,
Sure.
where you international currency units. Were you envisaging in the longer term having a whole world, if you like, the whole monetary system of the world organized with this sort of international clearing union at the top? So if you like, floating exchange rate system that we have now would kind of disappear. Or were you thinking about having some form of keeping that going, but having some sort of parallel redistribution system based on a bank? Or how would these two somewhat contradictory ideas, can they be blended, or is it one or the other? What's your view on that?
I haven't made up my mind completely on this part, but I'll tell you what we currently have is that we have a couple of stepping stones that can get us there. Yeah. One is the SDRs that the IMF has, which is a very limited supply, artificially constrained units based on membership at the IMF and so on. So you can scale that up as a way to allow the global South to further develop. The other component that we currently have is these swap lines that the Fed and other central banks offer to partner countries. It's an exclusive club of countries that have access to those swap lines, and these are usually temporary swap lines during crises, like during the COVID crisis, during the 2008 crisis, and they work beautifully in terms of stabilizing currencies, in terms of allowing countries to address severe economic instability and major recessions outside the U.S., right? So we can make those swap lines permanent and make them not exclusive to a club, right? And if you take that framework, then that becomes a global Keynes plan, right? Instead of having the Fed do it based on U.S. foreign policy, based on U.S. interest, you have an international agency essentially doing that, right? So I'm not naive in terms of the political implications of this. So the reason why the Keynes plan never took off, and every time we faced a crisis and somebody pulled up the dusty copy of the Keynes plan and put it on the desk, which did happen a few times in major crises, it only took a few days for people to dismiss it again politically, because there's always going to be a country that says, no, I don't want to give up my trade surplus and give it to other countries. So the reason I believe that it's actually possible to do this today, it's only possible to do this if we can make the legal, moral, ecological case, existential case for climate reparations and for colonial reparations. Then it becomes a question of survival. If it's a question of survival to transfer resources from the global north to the global south, then we have to design an orderly mechanism to do that. so that everybody's in on the system, everybody recognizes the importance of their contribution, and different countries will contribute in different ways. Some countries will contribute more financial resources. Some countries will contribute more with technological know-how, with transfer of know-how and physical resources. But it doesn't matter who contributes what, as long as we achieve the goal of dealing with climate change, of rebalancing the global economy, because none of this is sustainable politically, right? Even the top 1% recognizes that this is unsustainable, right? They just don't know how to do it without losing power.
Yeah, I mean, these are very, very interesting issues, and we could probably, I mean, we're on the Q2 now. We could probably talk just about, I mean, I'm fascinated by this updated Bangkok plan, you know, how it would actually work in relation to where we are now, where you might want to get to, what the intermediate structures might be. And I'm sure there's a book in that, or maybe more than one. So we're all excited by that, least of all me, but I mean, it's a brilliant area. But I'm going to move on to something else. There will be people, I'm sure, will have heard you speak on this area, will get in touch with you. I mean, you've already kind of really talked about it a bit, but other than what you've talked about, is there anything else you'd like to add on the Global Green New Deal that you haven't already said? Have you got any sort of message about that for the listeners, other than the things you've already said?
Right. So this is not something that, you know, we can hand out to prime ministers and presidents and kind of trust them to get together and introduce a global. None of that is going to happen unless we have social movements at the grassroots level that put pressure on political forces domestically to recognize the importance of structural global response. So even in the US, with all the efforts that many of my colleagues and I have been working on to put pressure on the political system for a US Green New Deal, to me, it's really, you know, at the end of the day, it's a waste of time if we don't do this globally, right? But of course, we have to achieve something at the local level if we're hoping, you know, even with the Bernie Sanders platform, the global component of his climate program was something like 200 or 300 billion dollars, or not even, I think maybe it was less than 200, which is nothing. And of course, it didn't address the structural issues of reparations and all of that. But I don't know if I want to call it good news. The good news is that the financial sector is actually recognizing how dangerous this is. They've known about this for a while, but now they're actually sort of almost in a panic mode. So there's this concept called the carbon bubble, which is, if you think of a financial market bubble, this is the climate risk that feeds into a financial bubble. Think of all the potential stranded assets that are worth trillions of dollars today that will go poof with the impact of climate change. Think of all the real estate properties across the world in coastal areas that will be flooded and literally will go from trillions of dollars worth of value, hotels and resorts and homes and so on, to a value of zero. You know, a flooded hotel is a flooded hotel, right? So all the fossil fuel infrastructure that will be phased out and will be displaced by renewable energy resources, all of those are also stranded assets. So depending on who you ask, the estimates are between 20 and 30 trillion dollars of a carbon bubble. That's the biggest market crash in the history of the universe, at the least, if not more. So now financial markets are recognizing that we need to mitigate this risk, because this risk is on their books, and their clients are investing their retirement money and their wealth and assets that will depreciate and will become stranded assets within my lifetime, right? We're talking about the next 20, 30 years and beyond. So now they're putting pressure on themselves, you know, quietly, and on central banks to help mitigate the risk. The Fed finally joined NGFS, which is the Network for Greening the Financial System, which was a network of central banks and financial regulators that I think was shepherded by the Bank of England. It definitely happened in Europe, and the UK is very big on this. But the Fed was never part of it. The Fed finally joined about a couple months ago. And you've probably seen the reports, leaked documents from Wall Street firms in the last year or so, one of which was quite interesting. It was reported on in The Guardian, which said the UN report on climate change, right? That gave us 12 years to go a couple of years ago. So they said they're actually optimistic. It's actually much, much worse than that. So the financial industry knows that the UN predictions are realistic, reasonable, and on the optimistic side. So they know that this carbon bubble is happening. So now we have sort of an opportunity where the interest of the financial industry, the insurance companies, is sort of aligned with the climate movement interest, at least partially, right? When it comes to introducing policies to mitigate this. And I think this is part of the reason why the Biden campaign all of a sudden changed, shifted gears in the last 6 months of the campaign, right around the time when those Wall Street firms were coming out with these statements saying we really need a climate policy. And all of a sudden, the Biden campaign was really concerned about climate change and decarbonizing the economy in a much more aggressive way. Yeah. So there's that, and guess what? The global carbon bubble, blast is going to happen in the global north, not in the global south.
Yeah.
So now we have to figure out a way to get governments in the global north to introduce rapid decarbonization, climate mitigation policies. So we have another thing on the table that says, hey, we need a global framework for this, so we can actually, deal with the carbon bubble, deal with the climate crisis, and undo some of these unsustainable socioeconomic and financial architecture that's been building up since the 70s and 80s.
Yeah. Now, Fadhel, here's an interesting question for you. I've heard a lot about this Great Reset. I don't know whether it's something you've looked in.
Yeah, the World Economic Forum.
Yeah. And what now, obviously some people talk about it being some sort of vehicle for taking over the world, or rich boys club, or whatever it might be. Others say it's a good thing, it's fantastic. Sure. I haven't personally studied it a lot. I mean, Sarah told me about it. I'd not heard of it really. Too busy teaching engineering. It was outside my normal reading list. Now, I just wonder what, in a very general sense, what do you think about this whole green reset? Is it something that's definitely bad, definitely good and bad? I mean, I think you have a very nuanced position on a lot of things, and a lot of our listeners and viewers will be very interested to know what you think about the whole deal, if you like, with the Great Reset.
Sure. So the Great Reset comes out of the World Economic Forum, which is not the place where I hang out. Or MMTers typically hang out. Yeah. But if you've noticed the last couple of years of the World Economic Forum, they recognize that inequality is a very serious issue. That it's a threat to world stability, right? Yeah. That the rise of populism is a dangerous thing. And they're looking at it from their perspective, right? These are the most powerful people in the world who hang out in this club. So they know they need to do something about it, right? That's a good thing, right? They recognize that the climate crisis is a very serious thing. They need to do something about it. But at the same time, they want to do something about it that doesn't undo completely the power structure that they have and the influence that they have, which is understandable. I mean, if you're in charge, you want to be in charge, right?
Yeah.
So the question is, what kind of great reset do we want? The kind of great reset that I was describing a minute ago is having grassroots social movement, what I call well-informed pitchforks. It's not enough to have pitchforks who are angry at the system, rebelling against the system, replacing one government by another government that uses the same policies, the same strategies. That doesn't take us anywhere. It's actually unsustainable and borderline dangerous on the long term, because you build these hopes for a better world, for a more just world, with these revolutions and replacing one corrupt government by a new one, and then you end up with the same policies, with the same people you've elected, or the same people, and that builds despair in the system. So we want well-informed pitchforks, grassroots movements that have a different vision, that have their own vision for a great reset. And I wouldn't use the same term, great reset. That's why I use the term global Green New Deal with climate reparations, colonial reparations, to address those issues. And I guarantee you that these ideas would not be welcomed by the World Economic Forum.
I think you might be right.
Once you start naming polluters, naming, you know, individuals, corporations, countries that are actually responsible for this abuse, and we have a track record, we have legal record for all of these things, then it becomes awkward, to say the least. So we definitely need a reset, but it's the global Green New Deal that I described is not the great reset that they have in mind. So what are the things that they have in mind? And this is kind of vaguely speaking. I'll give you an example. So I live in the US in a relatively rural area, and broadband internet access is just not available. I mean, internet quality in the infrastructure in the US is terrible. And we've been calling for, as part of a Green New Deal, sort of the rural broadbandification of the infrastructure, just like the US did the rural electrification in the 1920s during the Great Depression. So there's quite a bit of social movements, grassroots social movements, essentially demanding this and putting pressure on local politicians, on national politicians to do this. And especially with the pandemic, when you're isolated, when you have to do work remotely, when your kids have to study remotely, when you have to meet with your doctor remotely, everybody recognizes that we need this. So the idea was to have a decentralized, community-owned, community-managed, broadband network that would not be abusive. And all of a sudden, the top 1% decided, you know what, we can send rocket ships into outer space, and we can ask Elon Musk to do that, and he can beam broadband internet to everybody in rural areas. So have one company essentially managing the entire broadband infrastructure. And that's not the kind of broadband that I want. I don't want one company dominating and abusing the system again, and accumulating more economic power, more influence, more control, and more political influence in the process. So completely different vision for exactly the same thing that we want to produce. We want broadband access, but we don't want Elon Musk to control the world, right? We want this to be more sort of a participatory democracy, economic development process that actually decentralizes power and gives communities more role in determining how we want the jobs to be created locally. Elon Musk wants them to be in his company in outer space, right? We want very different visions for. So that's what I'm talking about. That's just an example of.
He sounded a bit like a Bond villain, Fadhel, in the way you put it. You imagine him up there, but maybe I'm being a little bit harsh. Now. Obviously, we've been going for it doesn't seem like an hour, but you're such an entertaining speaker, and I'm sure everyone's really enjoying it. Now, one thing I think is very important for me is I noticed this letter that you have, an open letter on African economic and monetary sovereignty. Now, I just thought it was important at this point, and I know there'll be some overlap with what you've already said, but I think it's important because it's something you've done and you're very involved with. You get the chance really to explain what that letter is about, what problems it's designed to address, and perhaps if you get support and information across to the people watching or listening today, that's got to be a good thing. So anything you really want to say about that letter, Fadhel?
Absolutely. So that letter came out of a conference that we held in Tunisia last November. I'm blanking on the years now because of the pandemic, but it was 2019. And the conference was set up by a group of colleagues of mine from Germany, Tunisia, Senegal, mostly involved with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. We're all sort of MMT informed people who are thinking about the global South, thinking about economic development, Africa in particular. And we thought, well, we need to bring these ideas to local audiences as opposed to talking about them in Western and Global North conferences. So we thought the conference needs to happen in Africa. Let's just bring the ideas and see if we were not intending for this to kind of explode immediately. We thought, well, we have to bring the seeds of the ideas and see what happens. And we were blown away by the amount of enthusiasm and positive response that we've seen from labor organizers, climate organizers, activists from all over the African continent, but also economists, traditional economists who do economic development work in the African continent. I remember one of the economists at the conference, who is an African economist, works with the African Development Bank. Halfway through the thing, he said, I've always known these things. I just didn't have a name for them. Now I know that there's a framework and a coherent set of ideas. Because if you work in economic development in Africa, and if you really care about the nuanced issues that I described, you realize that there is no standard framework in any school of thought in the economics profession that fully gives you the right tools to address that. So there is a thirst, there is a hunger for developing these ideas. So after the conference, we decided we're going to put together this edited volume, which will be out next year. And there's a call for a second follow-up conference, which will happen hopefully after this pandemic is under control in Dakar, in Senegal. And then when the pandemic started, we thought, well, we need to join other African scholars and public intellectuals and civil society leaders in calling for, let's call it a great reset. For rethinking. For rethinking, because the pandemic pretty much exposed everything we've been talking about, this excessive reliance on tourism and export-led growth and all of that stuff. So that's the context in which the open letter came out, and we decided, well, we wrote it obviously in English, and we said, well, let's translate it in French and German and Arabic because of the people who wrote it, my colleagues. Then we thought, wait a minute, we're trying to build a grassroots global South movement, and we're writing this in colonial languages for the elites. This is not going to go anywhere. So we thought, well, let's post a message on social media and see if we have colleagues who will translate this in native languages, or as many languages as we can. And we were overwhelmed. Within a matter of literally days, we had 50 translations, mostly from the global South, beyond the African continent, and some languages that don't even have a written script, only spoken language. And we thought, well, if we're doing this and we're trying to reach the average person in their own language, might as well, record the audio version of it. So we had a whole bunch of volunteers, literally more than 100 volunteers who translated, who recorded, who helped with all of this. And the letter is available with all the translations on our website, which is mes-africa.org. Maybe somebody can drop it in the chat box. And I encourage people to endorse it and sign it. It's not restricted to academics or policymakers. It's for all citizens of the world to engage with these ideas. And we're not kind of naive about the impact of this letter. It's not going to change the world. The idea is to open the conversation and invite people to think about an alternative way of engaging in economic development. And it's informed by some of the ideas that I discussed today.
Yeah, no, it's a very compelling letter. I read it. I really thought it was important to give you the platform to talk about that.
Thank you.
Well, Fadhel, on the next question, it's quite interesting because you've kind of alluded to some of these things already. I'll kind of, just for some of the listeners, just to kind of ask you, give a little bit of a shorter summary, perhaps. I'm looking at the time at 5 past, and I have a few more. I've got to talk about Fred, the main man. Obviously, with MMT generally, it tends to support floating exchange rates over fixed exchanges in general, higher fiscal space. And also, it tends to be somewhat jury's out on capital mobility. Now, obviously, you've talked about this sort of Bancor idea, which is associated with more perhaps historically operating within a type of fixed exchange rate system. I put that out. You might want to take nuance. So if you're, in summary, thinking about what would be your view on the general idea of floating exchanges in general are the best way and more, if you like, consistent with MMT's core message. To use our phrase that we've used a lot, nuanced view, taking the nuanced view, how would that work for the global south in terms of their attitude to capital mobility? When would they have it, when would they not? And finally, how would you see your sort of Bancorish means of, if you like, reversing the theft of resources? My PhD supervisor is a Marxist, and he talks about theft of resources. When he talks about aid, he dismisses and goes, it's return.
Right.
We're giving back what's been taken. So slightly more forceful, perhaps. Same message as yourself. So without talking too much, those three little things at points of a triangle, how could you maybe draw a bit of insight onto that, Fadhel?
Yeah, so I'll start with the sticky point, which is there's this debate, especially within post-Keynesians, and is it a fixed exchange rate or is it a flexible exchange rate? Pick one. Tell me which one does MMT believe in?
That's the one.
It's much more nuanced than that, and that's why sometimes on social media you don't get the full answer or the right answer. And here's why: because number one, when you talk about monetary sovereignty is not something that you declare. It's something that you earn and acquire with hard work, with the right strategies. So when we talk about the spectrum of monetary sovereignty in countries moving to higher and higher degrees of monetary sovereignty, it's not by decree. It's by acquiring economic resilience that allows you to get to a higher degree of monetary sovereignty, which at that point allows you to have a flexible exchange rate without having to throw your people under the bus. So when you have a stronger degree of monetary sovereignty, you have a stronger economic resilience to external shocks. So if there's an exchange rate depreciation, if there's a COVID crisis, if there is a financial market collapse, if there is a speculative attack, you have enough resilience to withstand those external shocks without having to let your people starve, without having to give up your economic policy to the IMF. Right. That's an important thing. So I will never say to a developing country, move to a flexible exchange rate and you'll have monetary sovereignty, because that's obviously nonsense. Right. So what we're talking about, higher degrees of monetary sovereignty allow you to have a flexible exchange rate, which means allow you to withstand external pressures without having to give up your policy for climate change, your policy for social justice, your policy for a job guarantee. And it's something, again, not by decree, but by strategic policies that you put in place. So that's probably the clearest way I can explain this in a sort of short answer. The long answer will require answering, well, what determines what are those factors that allow you that stronger resilience and as a result, a stronger degree of monetary sovereignty? And here we're talking about multifaceted components. The core of it for the global south is energy policy, food sovereignty policy, industrial policy that's driven by value-added content as opposed to anything goes, right? Race to the bottom. Those are kind of the three core components, but it has other dimensions, which includes dealing with corruption, dealing with the exclusive power that your importers have, dealing with cross-border traffic, and dealing with all of these components that actually suffocate your degree of fiscal spending capacity, and as a result, weaken your economic sovereignty.
Yeah, thanks, Fadhel, for that. Now, I know there's a book. You mentioned a book coming out, and I mentioned
the works. Yes.
Yeah, well, I mentioned to Bill when I was talking to him. I said, I know you got a book coming out, and he looked at me quite seriously. Went, which one? Because I mean, Bill, and I went, whoa, I only knew about one. Now, so I asked you the same question. You mentioned, I think, a volume drawn from your work. Just an idea for the listeners' viewers, what should they be looking out for? What's the time scale? So really giving them, whetting their appetite for the arrival of it, really.
So this project about a global Green New Deal with climate and colonial reparations really started as in response to a lot of the comments I get from colleagues who say, well, this U.S. Green New Deal is really not sufficient. And I completely agreed. So I started thinking about a more comprehensive framework. And I thought, well, I'm really good at putting ideas together as opposed to inventing new ideas. So in this project, I'm really not bringing anything new. I'm bringing the MMT lens. I'm drawing from the literature on reparations. I'm drawing on literature on climate change, on the bank war is obviously not my idea. It's just bringing all of these pieces of the puzzle together and trying to articulate a coherent framework that people can use to advocate for these transformative policies. So I thought, well, let's start by teaching a class. So this last semester, I taught a class on a global Green New Deal, and I managed to engage with these ideas with some of my students. So now I have sort of a working draft of the ideas. It's a matter of putting together a book proposal, hopefully in the next couple of months, and then actually finding the time to do this chapter by chapter. So hopefully 2021 would be the year.
Well, we're looking forward to it, Fadhel. Now, a lot of people are very interested in the job guarantee. It's something where I'm seeing questions coming. Now, obviously, there's this idea of a UBI that's out there. There's people who support the job guarantee and don't like the UBI. There's some people who kind of have a foot in both camps. They don't like to commit. So what would be your view on the job guarantee? What would your view be of the UBI? Would you see a basic income being necessary to go alongside, not universal, but just a basic income to go alongside those unwilling, unable to work? What's your view of the whole thing?
So from an MMT perspective, if we understand that the government has much larger spending capacity than what we're told, then the priority for me should be these three layers of public policy. The first one is universal public services that include health and education and infrastructure and so on, and doing it obviously green and clean, right? And raising the standards with living wages and access to childcare and so on. So all of that is universal public services. That's the first layer, and that will absorb quite a bit of employment, right? The second layer is a job guarantee, which guarantees employment to anybody who's ready, willing, and able to work, but wasn't able to find employment in the private sector, in the nonprofit sector, or the mainline government sector. And that's kind of the buffer stock employment program. And then finally, the third layer is not a UBI, not universal, but a generous income support for people who can't work, who shouldn't work for health reasons, family reasons, age, and so on. To me, the idea is nobody's left behind, so to speak, right? For people who actually want to work, we want a job guarantee. For people who can't work, we want everybody taken care of in terms of access to universal services and access to a generous income support so that nobody's left behind. Now, when the pandemic hit, a lot of people thought that the MMT world was turned upside down, because all of a sudden they hear many of us in the MMT community advocating for economic relief for people who were forced to go home and lost their jobs. To me, that's not a universal basic income switch. To me, that's coherent and consistent with a job guarantee, because we pretty much told everybody to go home because their most important job during the pandemic is to stay home, right? So for people who couldn't work remotely, to me, that's still consistent with the job guarantee, and it's not a permanent program. It's temporary economic relief to muddle through this crisis. So for me, the idea of a universal basic income alone is a very dangerous idea. It's a Trojan horse for neoliberal policies. If you look at who are really the biggest supporters, financially and politically for universal basic income proposals, and UBI alone without job guarantee, it's like the planet is on fire and we have millions of people who want to work, and somehow the solution is UBI. Right? That doesn't make any sense. So the Trojan horse idea is the following. It's the Uberization of the economy. It's the gig economy. It's the 0-hour contracts. It's no benefits contracts, which means you need the government to provide a few $100s a month to support at least your rent and maybe some of your food partially, but you're not going to be able to survive and thrive with that UBI. So you still need to hustle for a side job in the gig economy with no benefits, no contracts, no labor standards, And that's what I call the Uberization of the economy. It's not obviously just Uber, it's the entire ecosystem. And that's why a lot of these UBI proponents are in Silicon Valley. There's Silicon Valley CEOs who want the government to subsidize their gig economy infrastructure. And that's why it's dangerous. And all of these UBI experiments that they support, and mostly funded by Silicon Valley CEOs, they go to the lowest income community in some region, and they say, we're going to do a UBI experiment. We're going to give everybody $500 a month and then do a study and see if their life improves. Well, I could have told you that, when I was 5 years old. Yes, if somebody is really poor and you give them $500 a month, yes, they'll make better decisions with food, with health, with education. And these experiments are not just in the US, they're all over the global South. They go to the poorest village in a rural area in an African country, and they say, we're giving women a basic income. And we're going to study this village compared to the neighboring village that we didn't do the experiment in. And say, all of a sudden, the kids are better fed and women are making, it's almost as if like people didn't have the survival skills, the right decision-making skills until you brought the UBI program to them. Of course, they knew how to allocate and how to deal with scarce resources and how to make the best decisions they can with whatever resources they have. But that becomes then a justification for UBI deals with poverty, right? So these are the kinds of dangerous ideas if they're coming from that kind of political lens. But that doesn't mean that poverty doesn't exist. That doesn't mean that, but there is a better way to restructure the economy, because all of the UBI proponents are saying less government intervention, less government regulation, definitely no job guarantee, and definitely no labor standards, right? So that's the dangerous aspect of UBI, and unfortunately, it's like pinches a nerve that's very painful for many people in working class and lower income communities and progressives who really want, well, of course, if you give everybody $1,000 check a month, it will help. Yes, I'm all for it, but not in this way. We can be way more generous and way more effective at lifting people out of poverty and improving quality of life without setting this dangerous precedent, without undoing many of the other social services that many UBI proponents actually are in favor of. I mean, remember, this is the Milton Friedman proposal. Right, dressed up with the Silicon Valley logo now.
Now, I thank you very much for that answer, Fadhel. And for me, it's absolutely spot on, as much as I absolutely agree with all of it. Now, I'm seeing little questions coming in. It's up to you, of course. I'm speaking to the listeners now, the viewers. Really worth, I think, listening to that answer again from Fadhel, because I think the way that Fadhel sets out those three levels, to me, is very important. I know there's a constant debate about the UBI, and a lot of people making the case for it are good people, are progressives. They just haven't thought about it. And I think what you just said, Fadhel, it's very important. And I personally, listen to your answer again. I would recommend to the other people. We haven't got time for me to keep asking you more.
I'll just add one more example, because this shows up all the time. You say, how could you not support UBI for people who can't afford childcare, for people who can't afford medical care, and that's why I start with the universal public services. Right? Those are guaranteed universal human rights that every government is responsible for. So we're not going to take away your UBI and leave you without childcare. We'll leave you without access to jobs, or leave you without access to transportation. So it's very important, because sometimes people get into these rabbit holes about, well, are you against people affording their own healthcare and whatever? Of course not. We want that's the basis of the conversation.
No, thanks, Fadhel, for that. Now I'm going to come on to my kind of last of the schedule questions. I don't know how long you've got, if I can keep going, or an hour.
We still have a few more minutes.
Well, thank you. Tell me when you've had enough. We're all enjoying it though, so I'm going to keep you a bit longer, long as I dare. Now, I have a question about Fred Lee. I'm going to read it out, because it's I personally am a great admirer of Fred. To me, like yourself, he was probably the key force in drawing heterodox together. I did listen to him give an interview. I listened to him give a talk at a heterodox conference in England. I think it was the one that he gave in Greenwich, because he sadly passed away not long after that. I had a really good talk to him. And what I think about Fred, this vision of heterodox economists of different types, forming some form of community. Now, this is what my PhD thesis is about, and the book, not plugging my book, is about me interviewing guys about it. Now, obviously, in terms of MMT, you could say, right, MMT is a standalone school. We don't really need to talk to other heterodox economists, so forget about them. The other thing is slightly more nuanced, is, well, okay, we like them in some of them. You know, there are people you can't talk to post-Keynesians. All they do is build a career on criticizing MMT, you know, and that's all they do, apparently. And then, of course, there's certain Marxists. Some Marxists are very positive towards MMT, like my supervisor. Others keep trying to argue with MMT, particularly on money, where, I mean, to me, big mistake, but I would say that because I'm an MMT. Other people think, well, okay, no, we need a paradigm, we need a disciplinary matrix where all the heterodox economists are working together. So really, first of all, tell me a little bit about Fred from your point of view.
Sure.
And if you just let me, where do you lie? Do you think MMT, we're on our own? Should we be part of a community? Or should we think maybe as a long-term objective, we could have some sort of paradigm? Now, I'll leave it to you, Fadhel.
Sure. Yeah.
What you think a paradigm is, you know?
Right. So Fred Lee was just fantastic on this is a question for him to answer.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Because Fred Lee started his academic career as a grad student at Rutgers with Paul Davidson, Eichner, Young Kriegel, and others at the time. And he, you know, unlike the majority of post-Keynesians, he moved into the micro space as opposed to macroeconomics, and he made a career out of it, obviously. And then he moved to England. He taught in England for a while, and I think he was the founder of that heterodox economic association that you spoke of, and worked really hard to build that community. And then in the early 2000s, he came to UMKC, and I was just beginning my degree there in Kansas City, and I was assigned to be his teaching assistant, research assistant. So he was the one who threw me in the classroom intentionally to force me into learning how to teach. So I started my teaching career as a microeconomist. I almost wrote a dissertation working with him because I was very interested in Kaleckian economics and administered prices and kind of price theory. But then as soon as I learned about Kalecki and started learning more about the macro employment and economic development aspects, I moved a little bit away from that. But Fred Lee was very keen on building this ecosystem for heterodox economists to build a comprehensive pluralistic paradigm. And he was very adamant to engage with heterodox economists who thought that there were some inconsistencies and fundamental incoherence between different traditions within the heterodox space. And he thought that those were necessary tensions that need to be untangled. But there's a comprehensive unifying theme for heterodox economics to build. And he dedicated most of his life to that. I remember him spending literally hours after every conference gathering people's names and email informations and publication records and trying to build that email list, which he literally built manually. And I was one of the students helping him at the time for the Heterodox Economics newsletter, which he insisted on building an ecosystem of information, of where to find a job, where to find a grant, where to find information about other colleagues that you should engage with, because he thought there's no way of building that heterodox paradigm without building a community of scholars who engage with each other and mentor young academics into that space. So he spent a lot of time doing that. And then that obviously led him into his actual research and publications about the history of heterodox economics in particular, which many people are familiar with. But in terms of his role in the MMT community, which I think most people haven't noticed. I mean, he was right
Yeah, yeah.
there for that growth of the MMT community. So we used to have a series of Friday seminars, Friday afternoon seminars in the economics department. One Friday it will be the money seminar, and that was the MMT, the early MMT seminars. And there was the heterodox economics seminar that he led, with lots of guest speakers from all over the world who came to the MKC during those days. And there was the methodology seminar. There was a series of seminars. So every Friday there was something. So I remember the grad students who were being exposed to the MMT post-Keynesian approach, but also exposed to other approaches, the micro approach that Fred Lee was building, the pluralistic vision that he had for the community, but also philosophy of science and interdisciplinary guests from sociology and political science who were guest lecturing in that series. So we were kind of exposed to all of these ideas, but we didn't have a way of putting together those pieces of the puzzle in a coherent way. We knew that there was something there, but it wasn't clicking, and it was too early for us intellectually to figure out how to put it together. Especially that the senior faculty, you know, Randy Ray and Fred Lee and others haven't really put those things together yet, right? So we used to drag Fred Lee to the money seminar so we can have a better conversation with him, and he used to do it. I mean, it wasn't his thing. It was sort of in the early days, sort of a waste of my time. And I already know about this. I studied with post-Keynesians, and I know what Paul Davidson said, and I read Randy's book. But for us, we wanted more of the direct engagement. And we did the same. We dragged Randy Ray and Stephanie and Matt Forstater to the methodology seminars, and they didn't want it. They didn't like it. It was also sort of a waste of their time. But we wanted some minimal level of mutual understanding and communication so we can better engage with both sides. And it was very painful, very slow, but also very enjoyable in the sense that we knew that there was something that can happen. We just didn't know what it is. And the last few years of Fred Lee's life, and unfortunately he left us too soon, he actually intentionally started to incorporate MMT Job Guarantee framework into his work, into his work about market power, pricing power, governance structure, and so on. And that work is being done by some of his students, former PhD students who are out there now continuing to build that work. And in the last few years, especially in starting to think about the spectrum of monetary sovereignty, to think specifically about inflation, the inflation constraint, it was inevitable for me and for others to go back to Fred Lee's work and to draw from that administered price literature and the post-Keynesian literature on pricing to develop a new framework for inflation, because the actual index for inflation, CPI, is not the right measure, right? If we're looking at resilience of economies in specific sectors, then the inflation CPI index is a useless measure. And the mainstream also knows that it's a useless measure, by the way, because they've discovered targeting inflation doesn't really work for a variety of reasons. But at least now they know that their theory of inflation is unreliable, right? And they're admitting this. So we have an opportunity in the MMT post-Keynesian community to draw from Fred Lee's work, from Paul Downward's work, from Eichner's work, going all the way back to Gardner Means and Philip Andrews and all the post-Keynesian micro scholars that have developed that literature. It's, as I say, we're way understaffed in that space, and we need more work in that space to fully integrate that with the MMT community, with the MMT macro message. But if you've listened to this conversation today, it would be unfair to say that everything I said is MMT. And it's post-Keynesian, it's institutionalist, it's Marxist, it's all of these ideas that there are some inconsistencies, some tensions, some incoherence, you might want to say, but overall, there is a paradigm shift in the work. And that paradigm shift cannot happen with MMT alone. It needs the post-Keynesians, it needs the institutionalists, it needs the Marxists, the feminists, the ecological economists. Obviously, I've been doing a lot of work in this space. I've been, discounted for many years. They're central to this paradigm shift and this fight for climate change and so on. So I see myself as part of the Fredly tradition of trying to continue building that community as much as possible, but nobody can match the energy and passion that Fredly had for this vision for a pluralistic, heterodox economics universe. And I think we're moving in the right direction bit by bit. We just need to, sort of focus our attention to the important things, the policy things. I'm a policy solutions oriented type of person. And that doesn't mean we should ignore criticism. That doesn't mean we should all agree on everything. But that it also means that we should have an eye on the bigger prize here, which is this potential paradigm shift that we're seeing in the economics profession. Because I mean, I'm using the phrase paradigm shift because that's what's happening. The mainstream has all of these anomalies, all of these puzzles that it can't solve right now. And this is our opportunity to bring in new methods, new ideas. And I think we have all the tools in the heterodox community. Heterodox economists have been talking about inequality for decades. I've been talking about structural change. I've been talking about institutional adjustment and institutional limitations and corruption. All of these things are right there in our court, so to speak. The mainstream doesn't have the tools, doesn't have the interdisciplinary, multifaceted, multi-pronged approach to deal with this. All heterodox economists by training are at least partially interdisciplinary and recognize the importance of institutions. So we have the right tools. And I think we should use this opportunity to coordinate our efforts. That doesn't mean we should stop criticizing and self-reflection and all of that is healthy and important for our paradigm to grow and thrive.
Yeah, I mean, again, a bit like your answer on the job guarantee and UBI, absolutely agree with you 100%. I noticed when I was talking to a lot of economists, a lot of it comes out to personalities. Some heterodox economists are very open to other heterodox. Fred's at the top of the tree. I agree with you. And I found that some are very much in their own field, not interested in anything else. But there are many who are prepared to look at other heterodox approaches, recognize their potential for complementarity, recognize that we can debate, we need to debate. I mean, Sheila Dow, no doubt you'll do have the heuristics, as she call them, ways that heterodox economists or any economist should engage. But I feel very positive about this idea of a heterodox community looking to work together where possible, criticisms. Yeah, sure. But it's a very important thing to follow on with Fred's tradition. I remember reading his book, I think it was 2009, History of Heterodox Economics, which was fascinating. Perhaps one day you'll be writing a second edition, Fadhel. Or maybe giving it to a grad student of yours. I don't know. We're all busy, but hopefully there might be some young students listening now who you've inspired, that we're short of people in really good students to do postdoc in MMT. If you're listening, you're one of the 46 participants. Fadhel might have inspired you to get involved in this MMT movement. If I were 40 years younger, Fadhel, I would be doing it myself. But I said to my daughter, what should I do when I grow up? And she said, Dad, I think that boat has sailed. So I mean, well, Fadhel, yeah, well, there we go. I don't know if you have got time for a couple of questions at this point. I know I've kept you going for an hour and a half. Flown by for me. I can do 10 minutes at the most because my wife has other responsibilities and I have to watch the kids upstairs. All right, 10 minutes is fine. I've got some already. I may have mentioned before. I'll read them as they come. All right, so you might want to not criticize the wording, but I'm not in any way suggesting that these would be questions that I would have written myself. I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing. Yeah. So the first one comes via Claire from Steve Russell, if he's listening. This is Steve's question. He says, Western governments continue to cut the real terms pay and define benefit pensions of essential public sector workers, and we'd all agree with that. Decentralize and corporate-backed cryptocurrencies have been expanding money supplies on platforms that could easily impose small liabilities which resemble taxes, and offer defined benefit payments through smart contracts. Can you please promise we won't have a dystopian future of Amazon schools, hospitals, and police? Steve.
Okay, there's a lot of issues there. So the first part, yes, governments have been, implementing austerity policies because they believe they're constrained. They believe they're going to be disciplined by markets, and inflation is right around the corner. So all of the issues described in that first part of the comment were correct. And I think MMT in our discussion today shed some light in terms of what governments can do and what the real constraints are. The second part, which has to do with the rise or the prominence of cryptocurrencies and smart contracts and things like that, those are actually two separate things. Mm-hmm. So first, with cryptocurrencies, it's a misnomer. They're not currencies, they're commodities. As a matter of fact, that's how they're regulated. That's how they're perceived from a regulatory standpoint. They're speculative commodities. Think of it as a digital version of gold or silver or something like that. In terms of smart contracts, that's a separate universe, so to speak, because that's using the blockchain encryption technology to better communicate and enforce contracts for secure transmission of information, for hospital data and contracts. And so all of that is completely separate from, so I'm all for, more transparency, better security, lower transaction costs for administrative paperwork and data security and all of that. But a lot of people confuse that with the importance of cryptocurrencies, which also uses blockchain technology, but gives the illusion that this is now a new universe of blockchain everything, including the monetary system. So the short answer is, those three pieces. Yes, for smart contracts, for digital, better digital transactions and so on. No to austerity because of everything we discussed. But be careful with thinking that cryptocurrencies are money or will at some point displace the dollar or the pound as the actual currency that people will use for reasons that are obvious in the MMT community. One is that this is not it's not a sovereign currency. It's not tied to a tax system. Its value is extremely unstable. That's why it's a speculative commodity. And we're not even close to even thinking about central banks giving up national currencies and using a decentralized ledger system where you wouldn't have control over the money supply or have any tools to conduct monetary policy. Now, that doesn't mean that central banks are not looking at digital encryption technology for creating digital wallets for a digital version of a national currency. That's still anchored around a national currency, that's still anchored around a central bank and fiscal policy. It doesn't mean that Bitcoin is going to take over, right? So I'll just leave it at that.
No, I appreciate your answer. Thank you. And I've got time for a question from Barry Scott. Now, again, you might question the nuance of the wording. You might not. I'll read it as it is, Fadhel. This is a question. MMT requires excess money to be withdrawn from the economy via tax, using inflation as a signal. The current UK measure of inflation, CPI, which is an aggregation of 180,000 different prices. Also, CPI does not reflect asset prices, such as land, property, etc. How is it envisaged that an MMT policy would determine what should be taxed and at what rate?
Very good question. So I'm not very familiar with the UK CPI component, so I'll give a broad answer, maybe with an example from the US. But
that's fine, Fadhel.
That it's the same idea, at least in terms of policy. So MMT doesn't actually say you should wait for inflation to materialize and then tax to take money out.
Yeah.
And tax is not the only way to deal with inflation. And I think the listener who asked this question already knows that there are different components in that inflation index. Some components are not even included in the inflation index, but actually affect people's cost of living. So what MMT is saying is the fiscal spending capacity of the government is much larger than what we're told, which means we're able to tackle socioeconomic problems. We're able to tackle climate change. We're able to tackle a housing crisis. We're able to tackle a public health crisis, but always spend with an eye towards inflation. So when we say spend with an eye towards inflation, which means you need to anticipate before you even spend where the inflation pressure points will materialize. Is it going to be in housing? Is it going to be in food? Is it going to be in transportation? Is it going to be in energy cost? So, and we can, if we have time, I can explain how we can anticipate where the money will be spent. So those areas where you anticipate the spending to happen, because we know if you pay, you know, an average household $60,000, $70,000 a year of income to participate in a, you know, broadbandification of the economy, or whatever thing we decide to invest in a Green New Deal, then we know what the average family does with $60,000 or $70,000. They buy food, they buy transportation, they buy decent housing, they buy entertainment. So we know where the money is going to go into. And if we know that in the housing area, in the food area, and the entertainment area, we have enough productive capacity, we know that's not going to overwhelm the system and create inflation. The second part is we need to know where the market power can potentially exercise its influence and raise prices and use its abusive behavior to do that. And that kind of anticipation will allow us to think about what to do about it. Obviously, not spending and not creating jobs and not addressing the issues will not eliminate the market power, which is the source of inflation. So that's where we say tax and regulate the abusive market behavior in advance, right? Not after the fact. So and those are independent things. So I always say, you know, decoupling the spending from the taxing. So we tax to reduce inequality. We tax to reduce market power. We tax the oligarchs to reduce their power and influence in politics and in the economy, not because we need their money or their permission. We tax, you know, the polluters because we want to decarbonize the economy, not because we need their permission or their money to fund a public housing program or public health program. So spend with an eye towards inflation, which means you need to anticipate the shortage of productive capacity areas, and we can deal with that by having strategic investments to build up productive capacity, but also tax and regulate, not just tax and regulate market power in the financial industry, in the health insurance industry, and the energy industry before you even start your Green New Deal. You can't have a Green New Deal without tackling the market power simultaneously. I think the nuance that a lot of people miss on social media is that they think that MMT says we spend on all of these things and then we wait for inflation to materialize and then we hit it on the head. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah. Well, Fadhel, I've got one last question to ask from Sarah. I'm going to get, and I just ask, it's a short one, so I'm keeping on the clock. I don't upset your wife, okay? Which is, that'll be bad, wouldn't it? Sarah says, would a currency only valued for locally produced goods be a good idea? Do you think that could have any traction in your thinking?
So a complementary currency.
Yeah.
In other words. Yes, there's room for complementary currencies. I wouldn't say it's the ultimate way of dealing with a lot of these issues, but I myself have been working on complementary currency proposals in the US and other parts of the world as a plan B, because if the national government is not doing its job and we don't see any tangible evidence that says there's going to be improvement soon, especially during the pandemic here in the US, when the US Senate essentially told cities and municipalities, go file for bankruptcy, right? Then we had to switch gears and say, well, at least during this pandemic, we need to figure out a complementary currency solution so that we allow municipalities and states to deal with the pandemic. Because the federal government is essentially abdicating its power of the purse and saying, we're not going to give you any money. We'll go file for bankruptcy. So I see that as a plan B. I can see that as a sort of a ramp, as an on-ramp. Maybe it's an American expression, as an on-ramp to the highway of building a job guarantee or a Green New Deal framework, in the sense that it allows a small community to run a pilot project with the local funny money, so to speak, and then turn to the national government and say, look, we have the resources, we have the people, we have the logistical capabilities, and we did it with local funny money. But we need you to do this with a national currency at the national scale. In other words, demonstrate that we have the logistical, physical know-how and capabilities to do this. We just don't have the national government, more efficient way of doing this in a democratic, participatory way.
Yeah, thank you, Fadhel. Now, at this point, I'm just going to make a couple of brief points to the audience. First of all, Fadhel, fabulous interview.
Thank you.
I'm looking at the chat. It's all very positive. Okay. Fadhel has been interviewed on many other stations, the Macro and Cheese, lots of stuff will come from Christian and Patricia. They'll give you some links. If you've enjoyed Fadhel, I'm sure you will have done. There's lots and lots and lots of other ways you can listen to him talking in a similar way, maybe developing more of his ideas. And obviously, just to mention GIMMS here, we will be having Pavlina, one of Fadhel's colleagues out there in the US and the MMT community, particularly well known for work on the job guarantee, but lots of other areas. Sunday, the 27th of January. You can book on Eventbrite for that. Keep an idea of the times, maybe subject to change, but it'll be in the afternoon sometime. I can't remember the exact time. My feeling was it's mid-afternoon. Okay. And so that's Pavlina's one. I'm going to come back to you, Fadhel. Fantastic. Thanks for giving up your time. It's been a very rapid hour and 3/4 for me. I could talk to you for 4 hours.
It's been a pleasure.
And I hope to speak to you again about the projects we've mentioned. Fantastic to hear how positive you are about heterodoxy, positive about MMT. And I can only say, if I were 22, not 62, I would be, if I could, I'll be flying to America post-COVID and joining the MMT, or I'll be doing something here in Britain, or maybe even going out to Africa and working there. But MMT does inspire. So I don't know if you want a final word for the audience, and then we'll say goodbye, Fadhel.
Thank you. Well, I just wanted to thank you and the GIMMS team for all the good work you're doing. I would say, Phil, we need more of your work in the UK. The UK has been, a lonely place when it comes to the MMT work. There's a fantastic network of activists and organizers who are doing amazing work at GIMMS and the MMT podcast and other places. But there's been a shortage of MMT academics in the academic space. So thank you for the work you're doing. And I would invite everybody to check out more of the GIMMS website and the MMT podcast and other, the whole ecosystem of MMT, social media and online resources, and to engage with us in a way that allows us to fine tune and continue building this framework.
Yeah. Thanks, Fadhel. GIMMS is a fantastic organization. I mean, please check out the website, as Fadhel says. Watch the podcasts, email any of the GIMMS organizers. You can email me with questions if you've got them. Fadhel, I'm sure he's a busy man, but any questions for him as well. We love to answer questions about MMT. It's a very important movement, and GIMMS deserves our support. The mighty Bill Mitchell called them national treasures.
Absolutely.
And they unquestionably are, and that made Fadhel smile. He agrees with me on that one, I'm sure. I think we agree on most things, Fadhel. Fantastic stuff. So I'll say goodbye, Fadhel, to thank you again on behalf of everybody here in the UK and around the world who's been listening to you. All the best with your work. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you so much, Fadhel. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.